And I don't have a lot of time to allow you to process it, but these are questions for you to consider later, especially with the schools you actually work in or work with. Are you and your colleagues or those that you supervise on the same page philosophically about our core purpose, our belief systems? It's difficult to hold somebody accountable if we haven't reached a consensus about our philosophical focus. And if you believe that you are, could you produce evidence that proves that you are aligned? Like what? Like a common set of objectives, showing an aligned curriculum, common practices that you've adopted. So are we aligned, and can we produce evidence that we're aligned? That's the first stage. Let's move to the second one, which is, of the 4 stages, the most difficult because it deals with emotion. And we are very clear that emotions are very abstract and they can be very, very touchy. You think about some of the people that we admire in history. These are people who made great contributions to society, but many of them, their personal lives were a wreck. So just because you're smart doesn't mean you know how to deal with people. People bring their emotional side brings a whole new level of difficulty and challenges. So, next hard fact is that we have to deal with a very important emotion called frustration. And I'm sure you witness this firsthand all the time. A highly frustrated faculty becomes a highly unproductive faculty. One of the things that Dr. Peterson and I did together is that we put together a tool called a school culture audit. And I was just in Wisconsin yesterday conducting an audit. And what we do is we measure the components of school culture. And one component we were able to really address, and we were able to connect enough data to prove it, that frustration is a very high leverage emotion. And then as it goes up, we can actually pinpoint statistically how the staff's indicators of productivity start to go down. As frustration goes down, productivity starts to go up. So we can draw a direct line between the collective frustration of a faculty and its ability to productively implement good strategies, or if there's a high level of frustration, how they don't have the capacity when they're in a high state of frustration to actually implement those strategies and do them well. So the second phase of this process is managing frustration. Anybody ever feel like this some days or work with people who feel like this some days? True? Yes? No? All right. I don't care how many Hattie studies you can present. When a person is in that emotional state, their ability to be highly effective is compromised. And if I'm a productive leader, I have to recognize those factors that stimulate this emotion and work to eliminate those barriers and help people move beyond it. So the second phase is called managing frustration. It's not eliminating it. Frustration is a natural human emotion, and our ability to understand it and prevent it and manage it has a high leverage on whether we produce a healthy culture or not. So if you have a pen, I'd like for you to put an X through this slide. Toxic school culture. Put an X through it. This is the culture that we're trying to eliminate. This is the culture that you'll make a lot of investments, you'll plant a lot of seeds, but you won't get any productivity. What does it look like? Here's how Dr. Peterson describes it. A toxic school culture, just like a healthy culture, has a set of belief systems. They have some philosophies. And what's the philosophy of a toxic culture? That student success is conditional. And what are some of those conditions? The student's personal level of concern, attentiveness, background knowledge, and willingness to comply with the demands of school, among other things, and they articulate those beliefs to others overtly and covertly. Let's stop. So the philosophy of a healthy culture is we have an unwavering belief that success is possible. Toxic cultures have a belief that success is possible, but there are some prerequisites. And what are they? How much a student cares, their background knowledge, their commitment to the process. I have a question for you all. It's not rhetorical. Any of you serve any kids that are less than concerned? Less than attentive? They lack background knowledge. They don't do what they're told. Anybody got kids like that? So if this is the collective philosophy of the faculty, What happens when students don't possess those characteristics? What's articulated overtly and covertly? What's the message? That the problem is whom? You. And how come we're not seeing success? Because these kids don't care. They don't have the proper background knowledge. They don't do what they're told. And they don't engage in the process. So what this culture is saying is we have absolutely no efficacy whatsoever. That our achievement is a byproduct of the readiness of those that come. And that's why it's not a good idea to give schools ratings, because many of the schools that get good results, a lot of it has little to do with them. These are kids who already came with certain prerequisites, and the school becomes the beneficiary of characteristics that it never developed. And you change the student readiness, you get a totally different result. That's why I said it was sinister, to make some schools feel they were better than others because of what they needed to improve, because everybody needs to improve. So in a toxic culture, when they face difficulties, they have a pretty strong response. It's everybody else's fault. How would you anticipate a healthy culture might respond to students with these deficits? Because these are real deficits. It helps when students care. It helps when they have background knowledge. It helps when they engage in the process. These are legitimate gaps. But how would a healthy culture respond to this? Give me your theories. They try to build relationships and then do what? Provide support. But there's a step before providing support. They try to assess or reflect on the need. So we said in the model for healthy culture, the first stage is a healthy philosophy. Then they reflect on the deficits. Here's what they would ask. How come students don't care? What specific background knowledge do they lack? Why aren't they attentive? Why don't they comply? Maybe the lessons aren't engaging. Maybe the curriculum isn't relevant. Maybe we don't have a good support system. So they analyze their needs, and then they move from what we call reflective to what we described as prescriptive. They create policies, practices, and procedures that would address those deficits and would support their belief that every student is capable. Well, a toxic culture has a very different response. When they run into difficulties or obstacles, they become what I described as descriptive and deflective. Not reflective and prescriptive, they become descriptive and deflective. Have any of you ever worked with someone who finds new and creative ways to complain about the same thing over and over again? That is a clear indicator that you're in a toxic culture. What that is a coping mechanism. It's a way to make myself feel better about something that I don't feel qualified to positively influence. So when students are having difficulties, there's something soothing about finding other people who share that insight and then finding other people to associate responsibility for it. So I want to put these right next to each other. I talked about healthy and toxic cultures having different norms or habits. Here's one tremendous habitual difference. Every school has problems. Your health or toxicity is not based upon the nature of your problems. Every school has problems. It's how schools develop in their norms of responding to the problem. Healthy cultures become reflective and prescriptive. Their philosophy guides them to find resolutions, where a toxic culture finds other people to associate responsibility and deflect. So, by just looking at this pragmatically, I would not say that a healthy culture is a group of good people and that toxic cultures are bad people. That would be a very unfair analysis. What I can say definitively is that healthy cultures are productive and toxic cultures are unproductive. It's not good versus evil. It's productive versus unproductive. So if any of you are serving staffs or teams or districts that are stuck in the left column, in the infamous words of Dr. Phil, how's that working out? It might make a person feel better, but it does nothing to resolve the issue. So I have a question. If I could provide you with some tools and some insight on how to help people transition from the left column to the right column, would you be interested? Well, that's okay. Well, thank you. I'm glad. Well, let's go down and dig into what we know stimulates this behavior. It's an emotion called frustration. And Webster defines frustration like this. It's an emotion, it's a feeling of anxiety resulting from the inability to perform a task. So when I leave here, Crown Plaza, I have a goal, and it's to make it to the Springfield airport before my plane takes off. If for some reason the Uber is late or we run into traffic and I miss my plane, what would you expect my natural human response to be? Frustration. Does that make me a bad consultant? A bad person? A bad citizen? It makes me human. So first of all, I want to give you permission and tell you to relax. Everybody gets frustrated. It's as natural as breathing. When we have teachers who come in a profession who hope that kids would engage, they would grow and learn, and then they engage with kids who don't care, parents who are not engaged, a central office that's disconnected. We almost put them in an environment where we just organically create frustration all around them. And then we judge them because of it. Everybody gets frustrated. A productive leader, a transformational leader, understands that and has a response when it happens. Now let's get into some sociology. Sociology 101. Human beings tend to gravitate to the smallest and most familiar part of the organization. So when people get frustrated, let's look at migratory patterns. How do people tend to migrate when they get frustrated? Towards whom? Other frustrated people. And what starts to develop is what we call staff division, cliques, subcultures, groups who have different interests. So now we've taken all of this human potential and fractured it by not properly responding to frustration. And what ends up happening is that all of the responsible parties end up blaming each other. So here's a very predictable pattern when we do a culture assessment in a toxic culture. Part of the process is to interview a broad cross-section of professionals, teachers, counselors, administrators, and we ask them the exact same question. Questions. When we interview administrators in a toxic culture, guess who's always the culprit for everything wrong with the school? Teachers. They don't use their collaborative time properly, they complain too much, send too many kids to the office. Then I go interview teachers and ask them the same questions. And guess who's always at the center of all of the school's problems? They don't respond to the referrals. We have too many initiatives. I go investigate, and what I discover is that all of those accusations had merit. All of them were messed up. It wasn't one party. But the way they dealt with it is that they didn't come together to try to resolve it. They found other people who had the same experience, and they started pointing fingers at each other. So here's an illustration of what toxic cultures really look like through an example. They're like two kindergartners in timeout in separate corners, pointing fingers at each other. And we're going to go through some exercises to do what I call put our big boy and big girl pants on. Administrators, everything wrong with the school is not the teacher's fault. Teachers, everything wrong with the school is not the administration's fault. District office, everything wrong with the district is not the principal and teacher's fault. Principals and teachers, everything wrong with the district is not the district office's fault. In fact, to use the term fault is wrong. These are responsibilities that we have to take to address problems that affect us all. So, I'm going to ask you to do something that Rick DeFore wrote about years ago. He challenged schools to look in a mirror rather than out of a window. Turn your window into a mirror. Anybody can look outside of a transparent piece of glass and describe everything that's flawed on the other side. It's easy. It takes no discipline. Hang out with me for a couple of hours. You have a whole list of my flaws. But if I dare to look out of the window at you, guess what I'm going to see? Yours. So if we're expecting people to be perfect in their endeavor to try and be a profound contributor to growth of our systems, if we're looking for perfection, it's never going to happen. We're just a group of flawed individuals, collectively trying to do a good job. And if we look out of the window, we'll find explanations. We'll make ourselves feel better. But the person you can control most is the person you look in the mirror. So what I'm going to ask you to do, as I go through these exercises, don't think about what anybody else needs to change but myself. And if we all take responsibility and look in the mirror, we could recognize that the greatest person we could influence would be ourselves. And you just agreed with me that being reflective and prescriptive was more productive than being descriptive and deflective. One's looking in the mirror, the other's looking out of a window. So, for the administrators who are present, where you at? Can I see administrators? Thank you. I'm going to give you the first mirror because you are the leaders. In my book, The Will to Lead, The Skill to Teach, I write, and I'm not trying to be sarcastic, in 2016, I don't know why anybody would voluntarily choose to be a teacher anymore. The responsibilities are off the charts. Pay is flat or declining. Everybody scrutinizes everything that they do. We indoctrinate teachers into a world that is a recipe for disaster. And I have a whole section in that book on what I call the recipe for disaster. There are 3 key ingredients. The first one, inappropriate preparation. I don't care how much you love your alma mater. Can we all admit that there is no university in Illinois, in the United States, or anywhere in the world that could have totally prepared you for what you encountered as a new teacher? Is that a fair statement? When I was at Michigan State, I didn't have dramatic parent 312. Budget cut 416. Ever-changing administrator 216. I was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed 22-year-old who was ready to change the world and figured out I wasn't equipped. Let's go to the next ingredient. Poor support systems. How many districts actually spend time anticipating the needs of their new employees, the gaps that need to be filled, and strategically investing money and resources and time for people to get what they needed? I had a mentor when I was a new teacher, and he was awful. I don't say that to be disrespectful. He was. Our first meeting together, he had a staff list, and he had X's and O's, identifying all the people I could trust and those who were backstabbers. He openly admitted he didn't like kids. He liked history, but he didn't like kids. And I did everything I could to avoid meeting with him. Now, how was that a failure of leadership? Number one, my administrator, I don't know how he could have thought that was the best person to be an example for the teacher I wanted to become. He wrote more referrals than any teacher in our school. We had like 75 teachers in the school. He wrote more referrals than any teacher in the building, but my principal thought that he was the best example of the type of teacher that I was to become. He wasn't vetted. He wasn't trained. The principal never collected any feedback for me to see how I was going. I was dumped on a bad example and told good luck. Let's add one more. Task overload. We put these new teachers on every new committee we can find. They have to go to all these new teacher meetings. Then we walk in with our Danielson framework and tell them they're ineffective when they just walked in the door. Then we wonder why some districts have a teacher shortage. Before we're in a good position to judge a teacher's response, wouldn't it be a good idea to look in the mirror and ask, perhaps maybe our leadership might have put them in the position that they're in? I was on a conference call with a district in California about a long-term contract. And they had the associate superintendent, the superintendent, a lot of directors, and they were basically telling me everything I needed to come and fix with their teachers. And it was my response. I'm not coming to fix anybody. And what if I discover that the biggest problem is you? Would you be willing to accept that feedback? It got eerily silent. The conference call ended about 4 minutes later, and needless to say, I didn't work with that district. How can you judge a person's response when we don't reflect on how our behavior affected those people? But I'm not letting teachers off the hook. There's a mirror for you to look into, or them to look. Any teachers here? Well, go back and we got a couple. When people are ill-affected, they tend to gravitate to other people who are ill-affected, and they engage in a language called complaining. Toxic cultures have a language, and that language is called complaining. We don't have an isolated incident of complaining in education. We have a culture of complaint. In fact, we designate typically an entire physical space as a shrine to complaining in every school in America. What's that place called? Staff lounge. And if you had a good mentor, where did your mentor tell you to avoid? Staff lounge. Here's what happens when complaining becomes the methodology that we use to address frustration. Number one, actually we call them the 2 V's. The first V is called venting. And venting is a natural human need. If you think about venting from a nature standpoint, ventilation is Mother Nature's tool that she provides us to balance atmospheric conditions. Try sitting in this room for 6 hours with no ventilation. It'd be very uncomfortable. It provides some balance in our climate. So there's nothing wrong with periodically kind of cleansing yourself. Me and Sandra work in the same building. We have some common issues. If every blue moon we bump into each other and we just kind of let some things off our chest, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's a few studies that I cite in the book that show if you do that periodically, it's actually healthy. When does venting become counterproductive? When it becomes habitual, when it becomes a part of our norm. So if our norm is every time I get frustrated, I find other frustrated people and we swap narratives, here's what happens. We are using one another like human trash receptacles. And what happens when trash compiles and it's not properly processed? It starts to decompose and it rots and it stinks. So here's a little litmus test for you. You don't have to give me an answer, just reflect on it. Do you have a venting partner? If you do, that's not good. Because 2 bad things are happening. Number one, you and that individual or small group of individuals or clique, you're becoming psychologically codependent. All that you have in common is what you're disgruntled about. So the very nature of your interaction starts off as pessimistic and negative. Number two, consistent venting is the foundation for pessimism. So if Sandra and I use one another like human trash receptacles because we have very frustrating 5th period classes, and our method is 3 or 4 days a week to get together over a beer or something and talk about these bad 5th period students, but Thomas is having success with the students that Sandra and I are struggling with. He's courageous enough. He's having success. He hears us. And Thomas tries to interject some strategies. How do you think Sandra and I are going to respond to Thomas? Come on, what do you think? We're going to shoot down his optimistic idea before we even consider it. Why? Because we've developed a level of collective pessimism. When I go work with a school, and every idea I forward, they have a reason why it can't work, I know exactly why that happens. Because they use each other like human trash cans. And they've created a toxic environment where they're pessimistic, they're angry, they validate each other's frustrations, and they've almost created this kind of sinister solidarity. The second V is for validation. Freud taught us that human beings seek to be validated. That's part of our natural human yearning. So if I'm having problems with my 5th period class, why would I be motivated to seek 5 or 6 other people with the same dilemma? What would that do for me personally? But validate that the problem isn't me. I have evidence that there are other people who have this problem, so it must be these awful parents. It must be this terrible administration. It must be Illinois CSI who comes in and gives us all these strategies. Because other people share the common experience. It's almost like finding a citation for a research paper. If you're writing a research paper and you make a point, you have to find other people who can corroborate your point of what you just wrote as an editorial. So it validates our point if we can find other people who share that common objective. This is how we end up with two kindergartners in separate corners in timeout. All who can equally articulate why they feel the way they feel, why everybody else is responsible for it, but nobody's dialoguing. So I'm going to give you an activity. Go to your handouts and pull out TSC activity number 1. The directions are very, very explicit. What I'd like for you and a colleague to do, I'm going to give you about 7, maybe 8 minutes. What I want you and a colleague to do is to spend some time trying to pinpoint your specific frustrations. Now, want to do a little recap. Does having a frustration make you a bad person or an unconcerned educator? Yes or no? It makes you human. So I think it'd be intelligent for us to spend some time figuring out what stimulates this emotion. Teachers who don't follow directions, kids who don't turn in homework, parents who aren't cooperative, new school improvement initiatives. What are the things that drive you there? And this is a one-on-one activity. You and a colleague, 3 would be the maximum if there's an odd number, but no more than 3. Only one person needs to take notes. Once you identify on the left column what frustrates you, immediately after you identify the frustrating issue, on the right column, identify what have you tried to do about it. And if you haven't tried anything, what do you recommend? So 2 very clear directions. You and your colleague try to identify things that you collectively find frustrating and write down what have you tried to do to solve that problem, or what do you recommend be done to solve that problem. Take about 7 or 8 minutes, roll up your sleeves, be as authentic as possible. When we finish, I'll explain why I asked you to do this. If something is frustrating to you, that's all that counts. It's a personal emotion. Nobody else has to experience it but you. And one of the big mistakes that leaders make is they try to judge the validity of somebody else's frustration. Just because something comes easily to me doesn't mean it should come easily to you. So if something's frustrating to you, I have to accept its validity. So we're not going to come up and do a frustration show and tell. I wanted to do a quick little review. Are we still under the agreement that being reflective and prescriptive is more productive than being descriptive and deflective? We're still on the same page? Yeah. So I don't want you to get mad at me, but I set you up. I wanted to give you an opportunity to forget that you were in a professional setting and allow you and your colleagues to start to talk about things that affect you emotionally, things that are frustrating, where you'd forget that you're in a professional environment. So you can do a personal analysis of your habits. I don't want you to raise your hand, but if you had to go back and analyze the last 7 minutes, did you and your colleagues spend more time on the left column or more time on the right? If you found more time on the left, there may be some challenges personally that's a mirror moment. Now, if I'd have given you like 20 minutes, it gets out of hand. Hands start flying up. Oh my God, did you hear? Now tell me if I'm telling the truth. That left column is seductive, isn't it? You described something. Somebody else shared your experience. They added their narrative. They empathized with where you were coming from. And could you find yourself, as you got deeper into the conversation, being stuck on the left column? It happens to all of us. And it doesn't make us bad people. Doesn't mean we're unconcerned about kids. There's something soothing about that. What we want to do is to move people from that left column to the right column. So, go to your next handout, and it says it should say Staff Concern Form, because we're going to put our big boy and big girl pants on. Now, I want to share with you a strategy. It's a Staff Concern Form. A strategy, and there are many I could share with you. I just want to share this one with you. Pay attention. I want you to recognize that in the process of improvement, there will be things that emerge that are uncomfortable for people. It's frustrating. You've uncovered one of their frailties, or you put them in an uncomfortable position. You cannot improve without some sort of pain or some sort of discomfort. If you're uncomfortable after a workout, it wasn't a good workout. Discomfort and improvement are connected. So in the process of improvement, we are going to stimulate some things that are uncomfortable. There was a school that I work with that's in Virginia that was definitely a hot mess. Did an audit, and all of the feedback from teachers was that everything that was wrong with the school was whose fault? Administrators, everything wrong with the school is the teacher's fault. Well, I'm sitting down with the administrative team, and there's a principal and 2 assistants. As I'm reviewing the results from the assessment and going over some of the concerns the teachers had, their frustrations. Every time something was unfavorable for the administration, they'd immediately come back with a very, very strong response of what the teachers don't do well. But we had a breakthrough. One of the things that the teachers said that the administration, in particular, the principal, didn't do well is that he was a very poor listener. And he immediately responded with, "That's not true, I'm a great listener." Here's a little insight. If you have to protest the fact that you're a good listener, you're probably not a very good listener. And it was my 3rd trip to this school, and I could empathize with the teachers. He was an individual. Personally, I'm a very easygoing person. I have a very small list of pet peeves. At the top of my list, of my very small list, is cutting me off while I'm talking. He did that habitually. And he wasn't malicious. He was a nice guy, but he just didn't listen. So as he's in this protest about how he's a great listener, I said, "Sir, with all due respect, you pay to listen to me and you don't listen. I know you don't listen to your teachers." To his credit, it was a mirror moment for him. He had gotten some feedback from several sources. 3. Teachers said he didn't listen. A stranger said he didn't listen. He added one more source. He said, "My wife said the same thing." So it was clear. He couldn't deny it. The evidence was overwhelming. So he started looking depressed. I said, "Don't look depressed. Don't jump off the ledge yet. I got a whole list of other stuff you don't do well either. We're just scratching the surface." I said, "But it's obvious from the audit, there are a lot of things that the teachers have to look in the mirror about. You guys are equally culpable. The dysfunction is equally spread. Are you going to fight each other? Or are you going to work together?" So I called the union reps into the meeting. They had 3 of them in their building. I went over the audit with the union representatives. It was obvious that the dysfunction was equally weighted. I said, "You all have a vested interest in working together to resolve each other's issues because you work together and you need each other to do this." I shared the audit with the staff, went over it, and I said, "Your administration is willing to accept their responsibility on things that they need to improve that put you in a bad position, but you have to accept yours. And what you have to accept is that you are killing your school's culture with your mouth. Your persistent pessimism, your complaining, your slander, your gossip, your negativity is destroying your culture. And it will not improve until you look in the mirror and accept it and resolve to do something different." To their credit, they did it. I challenged them to take a 30-day moratorium on complaining. And they did it. I said, in place of that, we're going to put together a process that allows your legitimate concerns to be processed, addressed, and resolved. They agreed. Twice a month, the administration would sit down with the union reps, and every employee in their school got access to this form. Teachers, custodians, counselors, secretaries, administrators, anybody in their environment who had something that really bothered them or was an obstacle to their progress, they would fill out this form and turn it into the main office secretary. And twice a month, the administration and the teacher union representatives would sit down in a dialogue to address and resolve the issues. Anybody turning this in had to write their name, the date, and sign it. There was a little bit of controversy of whether people needed to sign it, but we all decided that if you don't own your own grievance, this could be used for mischief. So if you don't put your name on it, we're not going to process it. You have to be courageous enough to at least take a vested interest in solving your own issue. Next, Whoever levied the concern had to identify on a Likert scale of 1 to 5 how serious the concern was to him or her. 1 meaning it's not a huge deal, get to it when you can. 5 meaning it's an emergency. The first one we ever processed, the issue was that there wasn't a working paper cutter in the staff lounge or staff workroom. And guess what the teacher rated it? A 5. And the principal immediately rolled his eyes and I said, stop. If it's a 5 to her, that's all that counts. I said, you'd be lucky if all your issues were this easy. How do you think we resolved it? He stopped at Office Max on the way home and bought 2 of them. Bam, problem gone. Whoever had the concern had to write a narrative describing their concern, but there's some rules. No sarcasm, no hyperbole. I'm kind of dating myself. Remember Dragnet? Just the facts. Some of the young people are like, what? Look, Google it. Just the facts. Whoever levied the concern, last part, had to make a recommendation to the team about what their ideas are about resolving it. Now, I didn't mean that's what the team was going to do, but you had an obligation in making a recommendation about how you believe this issue should be resolved. They would sit down, the secretary was present, they'd roll up their sleeves, I made sure they sat next to each other, none of this across the table, bargaining, adversarial stuff. Principal next to union, union next to assistant principal next to union. I made them sit in a circle and split up. And whatever they came up with, the secretary would take note of it, and the next day a memo was published with all of the issues that were addressed and the collaborative team's proposed resolution. Let's say, let's say Dawn recognizes one of her concerns. We don't put your name on it on the memo, Dawn, but you're not satisfied with the proposed resolution. You can appeal. You can go meet with one of the 3 administrators by yourself, and we would pick a neutral third party who we both believe would listen to our sides and try and help us find a resolution. Can I ask your name? Let's say Carrie is a counselor, and we agree that Carrie is neutral. Set up a time, Carrie will listen. She started off as a mediator. At some point, Carrie will become an arbitrator if we can't agree. Whatever Carrie recommends, we go with. Last part. Once it's resolved, all paperwork with Dawn's name on it is shredded. We don't keep a dossier or an FBI profile. We're just glad that you brought it up, because I'm sure other people had the same concerns. That was one of the concerns about putting a name on it. The principal who was there currently wasn't malicious, he just was a bad listener, but he wasn't malicious. Their concern was if we compiled these things and a new principal came in and Dawn had a file with 179 concern forms, that she might be labeled as a troublemaker. All we care about is the resolving the issue. There are 38 schools that Dr. Holly and I have certified as high will, high skill. This school, who was one point a hot mess, is one of those 38 schools. I'm not saying I'm not trying to offer that it was because of that one thing, or that one strategy, but it was a very big step in the right direction. The toxic nature of their interaction was revealed, and they were willing to find an alternative way to address it, to manage their frustration, rather than have it metastasize into an organizational disease. They were willing to put their big boy and big girl pants on. So we had to first expose the nature of their toxic interaction, then start to work with creating mechanisms that would allow them to resolve it. So, to make a long story real short, a healthy culture becomes a group of problem solvers, and a toxic culture spirals into becoming a group of complainers. Let me sum this up for you in an example and an illustration that will hopefully make this really resonate. How many of you are fans of Jim Collins? Any Jim Collins fans? Okay. I'm a big Jim Collins fan. And one of my favorite Jim Collins books is a book called Good to Great. Heard that book before? All right. Jim Collins, in 2001, published a book where he and his Built to Last team tried to find out what separates a great company from a mediocre or average company. Well, my first book was called Transforming School Culture. Very similar research design. I wanted to find out what separates a healthy culture from a toxic school culture. Very similar analysis. But his was with business, and mine was with schools. And I want to make this, because I'm around some very influential and powerful people in this room. Please take note that whenever you try to apply research from another profession, be a critical consumer of that research. Everything that's applicable in business doesn't easily translate or transfer in education. Let me give you one. In business, competition is a very, very strong principle. Would you agree with that? If I own the only restaurant in Springfield, what's my motivation to create a quality menu and have competitive prices if I have no competitors? You either eat what's on my menu or go home and cook. But build 5 restaurants in a square mile, now I have to improve my service. What happened in education? We tried to legislate that principle that was a business principle and make it an education principle with choice and competition. How did that work out? So we have to be critical consumers. So I don't take other professions' research and just blanketly apply it to education. There are 2 areas where Jim Collins and I are in agreement. It's not that the other areas I disagree with him. They're just not applicable to education. 2 key areas. One of the things that Jim Collins wrote that great companies do differently than mediocre, and I found the same thing in my Transforming School Culture study, is that great organizations seek and confront what he refers to as brutal facts. And what are brutal facts? They're nothing but measurable problems. Why would a great organization spend time and resources trying to statistically pinpoint where they're flawed? How would that be beneficial? You can't correct a problem you're not keenly and clearly aware of. What I found in my study is that schools are actually really good at this. If there's been anything positive to come out of No Child Left Behind, is that we are more data-driven today than we've ever been. You agree with that? Yeah. You probably have data nightmares, don't you? Smart goals attacking you in your sleep. You'd be hard-pressed to travel Illinois and find a school that isn't keenly aware of their brutal facts. If they don't seek them, Springfield doesn't have a problem shipping a whole report full of brutal facts. So we don't struggle with that. It was the second characteristic where there were problems. What Collins wrote is that great organizations get the right people on the bus, in the right seats, moving in the right direction. Now, I want to make an editorial note. Had a chance to run into Jim Collins about 4 years ago in South Carolina, and we both spoke at this conference. And I told him, I didn't like the term right people. Right people, there's a lot of assumptions there that leadership has impeccable judgment. My language would be get everybody on the bus, in the right seats, moving in the right direction. Because if I'm a leader and I don't believe I can influence you, that's what we think bad teachers do in the classroom. How many of you would like a teacher to come to you and say, well, I could have gotten better results if you'd give me the right students? Doesn't even sound right, does it? So I don't think it sounds right when a leader says, is given the authority to determine who's the right and wrong people. If you're a transformational leader, you want to use your influence to help everybody become the right person. What is the bus? The bus is a metaphor for a technical change. I told you this morning that technical change is absolutely essential when it's the right change implemented strategically for the right purpose. So what did Einstein call insanity? Doing what? Same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So if there are results or brutal facts that we're not happy with, the worst way to get better results is to do exactly what we did before and expect a different result. That's why technical change is necessary. So if we look at literacy and we're not happy with the results, the bus could be Fontes and Pinnell. It could be balanced literacy. It could be read like a champion. There are a lot of great strategies, seeds, that people could use to improve it. Where's the breach? Here's what I want you to think about. In your school or your district or the schools or districts that you support? How long does it take people to move from acknowledging the problem, reflection, to the willingness to actually change their behavior and consider a better policy, practice, or procedure, prescription, to actually do something about it? If people get stuck between acknowledging your difficulties and the willingness to change their behavior to fix it, you don't have a technical problem. You have a cultural problem. Don't go buy a new bus. There's nothing wrong with your bus. It's the culture. The distance between those 2 points, I call in my literature adult drama. Anybody here ever experienced any adult drama? I have a definition. You feel free to use it. Adult drama is defined as dysfunctional social interactions between adult professionals within the school environment which interferes with the proper implementation of better policies, practices, and procedures. We're all aware of our challenges. We're all aware of the direction we like to go. How come we don't have people on the bus? Because when people get frustrated, they gravitate towards other frustrated people to make them feel better about what they're frustrated by. And they engage in combat. And what does some of that combat look like? Slander, gossip, dirty politics, misuse of authority, nepotism, disengagement. So instead of everybody coming together to get on the bus, if we don't address frustration properly, it grows into this construct called adult drama. So I work with districts who spend millions of dollars on technical innovation. They bring in some of the best experts in the country and the world. How come they're not making any progress? Because they're trying to plant those seeds in an environment of adult drama. They're not listening to people. They're not building trust. They're not trying to resolve issues. They're just fighting each other. So everybody's trying to one-up each other. Well, adult drama was so diverse, I had to create what's called a theoretical framework, and it's the whole basis of my first book. What I found was that when people get frustrated, they tend to gravitate into subcultures that validate their construct or validate their objective. I call those 4 subcultures the believers, tweeners, survivors, and fundamentalists. This is how adult drama looks. It's a theoretical framework to help understand what adult drama looks like. So when you go back and you're trying to get people on the bus and they're not getting on, it's because they've gravitated to people to make them feel better about where they are. Our goal is to first prevent this, or if we have it, to eliminate it so we can get everybody on the bus. How many of you would like to work in an environment that whenever a critical issue is identified, the only response of your colleagues would be this: what do I need to contribute to help solve it? Who would like to work in an environment like that? You know what it's called? It's called a healthy culture. That's what it's called. They're reflective and prescriptive. When that's not happening, you have a level of division that is the result of unresolved frustration. Who are the believers? Those educators who, for some reason, their personal and professional objective is aligned with the school and district stated objective. Most of us articulate in an egalitarian focus. Is that true? If I were to come to your school and look at your mission statement, I am confident it mentions something about all, every, or each. Is that true? Probably makes you want to shed a tear and sing a chorus of We Are the World, doesn't it? We want every child to be successful. Raindrops and butterflies and unicorns. I mean, it's beautiful. There are people in high-performing schools and low-performing schools who operate from that objective. We call them believers. And when problems arise, what's their response? What do I need to contribute to help solve it? To a believer, change is not a 4-letter word. But I want to warn you as leaders that bad leadership can shift a believer to being a fundamentalist. So, let me ask you a question. I don't want you to believe that a believer is a yes person. If my objective is success for every student, and you can provide me with brutal facts that that's not happening, give me a scenario when a believer could be legitimately resistant. Why would a believer be legitimately resistant getting on a particular bus? Give me a rationale. It's not the right bus. Or they have an alternative theory about how to address it. They don't doubt that the problem needs to be addressed. They don't doubt the change needs to happen. They just don't think PBIS is the right direction. They don't believe that literacy strategy is the right strategy. That doesn't make them your enemy. They have a different theory. So what would a good leader do? Listen, gather evidence, try to create a compromise, or if they can't reach a compromise, try two pilots. Let one grade level try it one way, a different grade level try it a different way, do some action research, gather some evidence, and figure out what's the best bus. Don't assume because somebody disagrees with you that they're your enemy. Bad leadership frustrates believers into being fundamentalists. You make it make sense, your believers will skip on your bus. No problem. Let's go to the second subculture. We call them the tweeners. Who are the tweeners? These are our new members of our system. Their objective is to simply find out where they fit. They're so cute. They walk in optimistic. They're ready to change the world. And they don't know whether to get on the bus, hitchhike, Uber. They're trying to figure out where the copy machine is. What's the code to enter my computer database? We compiled a lot of data, and the two most accurate statistical predictors of organizational health was the retention rate and job satisfaction rate of that group. Of the 34 schools that we studied, whenever there was an 80% retention rate and above, and we gave them job satisfaction surveys for 3 straight years, as retention was high and job satisfaction grew, those were the two most accurate predictors of the health of the organization. So if you walk around thinking, do we have a healthy or toxic culture? Go look at 2 data points. How are we grooming our new people? And are they staying over a longer period of time? So we found that tweeners tend to walk in with the DNA to be believers. And if a year later, 2 years later, I'm even more optimistic, I'm even more committed, what does that say about your culture? That's some good culture. That's some good soil. You took optimism and increased it. If a year later, I'm filling out fast food applications at all the local fast food restaurants, I want to throw away 4 or 5 years worth of tuition and loans and student teaching, what does that say about your culture? We took optimism and our culture destroyed it. So you don't have to guess how your culture is doing. You really want to know, and you want to know empirically, how are they doing? They're a great investment. I would spend a lot of time and energy constructing supports for them because they are the best indicator of the health or toxicity of your culture. The third subculture we call the survivors. Can any of you guess what the objective of a survivor is? How do I make it from 8 to 3 or from August to June? These are people whose frustrations have grown so profound that they have totally disconnected from our fundamental purpose. They're holding on with their fingernails. And I don't want you to think of these people as malicious or culprits. They are victims of a toxic system. Their needs have gone ignored for so long that they really forgot why they're even here. Now, this is true, and we don't manipulate data. The highest concentration of survivors in our sample were in urban districts, where people did not receive the training or the support, or they weren't prepared to deal with some of the risk factors they were dealing with, and it wasn't a long period of time without the proper support that they could spiral into being survivors. If you have an inordinate number of survivors, that's a very bad sign for your culture. Last but not least, the fundamentalist. A fundamentalist is as different from a survivor as a believer is. A fundamentalist is an individual in your organization whose objective is to maintain status quo. They have a vested interest in your current system. So here's what we found all the time, often with PLC. People would come to Chicago or Vegas and they get real excited in an isolated conference environment. And they go back excited. They buy all the PLC books. They're ready to change the world. And then they discover there are people in their school who like working in isolation. There are people in their school who like controlling curriculum by themselves, assessing by themselves. And it's not that they don't see the brutal facts, but I like to call the fundamentalist a me first as opposed to a we first individual. What's best for me is more important than what's best for the organization. If any of you've coached sports and you've had a player, even a player with very, very great talent, if that player's personal statistics are more important than team aspirations, that player starts to break down the composition and the chemistry of that team. That's what fundamentalists do to schools. So instead of getting on the bus, the goal of the fundamentalists is to puncture the tires of the bus and push it back in the garage. Does that sound dramatic to you? This is ground zero for frustration. If we don't address it, here's what it becomes. So what do we need to do? Anticipate it early, build infrastructure to address it, so that we can get everybody on the bus in the right seats, all moving in the same direction. So, as we go to break, I want you to think about these questions. You can talk about it over coffee. Are people in your environment typically reflective and prescriptive, or descriptive and deflective? And if so, if they're descriptive and deflective, what major frustrations do you believe is fueling their ongoing protest, their bad attitudes, their pessimism? And secondly, do you have an active group of fundamentalists in your environment? Are there people who are loud, who are active, who are influential, who are actively protecting status quo? And how are they affecting your culture? Let's take a 15-minute break, actively talk about this over break, and we'll come back and go to the next phase. Enjoy your break.